The Medical School HQ podcast, session number 77.
Dreams don't come true. It's a plan that comes true. And so you've got to put a plan out there.
Hey, this is Z-Dog MD, rapper, physician, legendary turntable health revolutionary, and part-time gardener. And you're listening to the Medical School HQ podcast, hosted by the irredeemably awesome Ryan Gray.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Ryan Gray. And as always, I believe that competition amongst your pre-med and medical student peers is detrimental to becoming a great physician. In this podcast, we show you how collaboration, hard work, and honesty are critical to becoming a superior physician in today's healthcare environment. How you guys doing today? How are you doing today? I want to, once again, during this month of May, thank the Princeton Review for supporting you, our listener. During the month of May, use the code MSHQ5 and you will save 10% off the Princeton Review's MCAT Ultimate Classroom or MCAT Ultimate Live Online courses. MSHQ5, save 10%. Go to princetonreview.com and enter that promo code. If you don't remember the Princeton Review and what they have to offer and why they're a little bit different than some of the other test prep companies, I talked about it with Chris back in session 17, medicalschoolhq.net/1717. We talked about how the Princeton Review uses multiple instructors for their different topics, for the different sections of the MCAT. So you'll have a verbal instructor, you'll have a biological sciences instructor, you'll have a physical sciences instructor. It's broken down more than some of the other test prep companies out there, which is why I think I would recommend them over everybody else, because of that opportunity to learn from multiple instructors and not just one instructor, which is how I learned when I went through the MCAT, and I didn't jive with the one instructor that they gave me, and so it wasn't as good of an experience for me. So the Princeton Review, I love how they have their classes set up. Go to princetonreview.com, use MSHQ5, and you'll save 10% off of their MCAT Ultimate Classroom or MCAT Ultimate Live Online courses. Meaning live online, meaning you don't have to have a Princeton Review classroom near you. You can do it all online and still get the benefit of multiple instructors and live interaction with the teachers. So thank you, Princeton Review, for your continued support of the Medical School HQ podcast. Today, I have an interview with Ben Abney, who is a very non-traditional medical, I'll call him a medical student. He's starting medical school in the fall. He's gotten into a couple medical schools, and he's down to the wire in deciding where he wants to go to school. He wrote me and Allison a very long email, over 4,000 words, titled How a 38-Year-Old Active Duty Applicant with a Family and Average Scores Got into Medical School. And he wrote it saying that he hopes it might help the next person in a similar situation. And that's what this show is all about, helping the next generation of pre-medical students, medical students, on their journey, showing them that there isn't one path to getting into medical school, showing that there isn't a perfect applicant to get into medical school. And so after I read a little bit of this, I didn't read all 4,000 words. I read a little bit of it and realized that I need to stop reading this and just ask Ben if he wants to come on the podcast. So I did, and he agreed. And so Ben's going to talk about his journey, some of the stuff that he learned, what worked for him, recommendations that he may have for you as you go on your journey as a pre-med and as a medical student. Ben, welcome. Let's start with talking about your aha moment and when you knew you wanted to be a doctor.
I didn't have a special moment where I said, "Oh, the clouds have aligned and I will be a doctor at this moment." I do remember the first time when I said, "You know what? I'm gonna take the biology classes and just kind of take the first step in that direction." And that was a moment where I was talking to my wife and we were just talking about, where do you see yourself in 10 years or 15 years, and do you feel like you're tracking in your life where you want to be? And I did have that gut check of or that check of thought of maybe I could be doing something a little bit more. And it was going to medical school was always kind of a back burner item. I mean, growing up thinking like, I'd love to be a doctor, and then at some point letting that kind of dream get away from you, and you go to college, you move into a career, you have some kids, you get married, and then it's 15, 20 years later, and you got to look back and you got to go, well, am I doing what I want to be doing, or am I doing just kind of where my life is led to where I am today? So I don't know if that answers your question about when I had that moment, but I definitely did have a moment where I said, I'm going to go to take that first class. And that was just a few years ago.
And you are how old?
I am 38. I'll be 39 this year.
So you are a true non-traditional. That's
right. It cracks me up when I talk to these guys who are, they took 2 years out of college and they're going, "Oh, I'm a non-traditional." Just relax.
I've experienced life. Yeah.
That's right.
So what have you been doing for the past 15 years?
Okay, well, I graduated from Indiana in 1998, and not too long after graduation, I joined the Navy. I joined under the Navy's NUPOC program, and I went to Officer Candidate School and became a nuclear power instructor, and was stationed down in Charleston, South Carolina for a few years down there.
All right, so pause there.
Okay.
So you went to college.
Right.
What did you study?
I studied my master, or my it was in mathematics, and I minored in physics.
At any point during your undergraduate years, did you think about being pre-med?
I did think about being pre-med. I had a roommate who was pre-med, and at that point, though, I just didn't see how I could do it. I was looking at the debt load, looking at the reality of going to school for another 4 years, and I just didn't think it was in the car. I didn't think it was a possibility. So I had grown up in a very poor family, and the idea of even going to college was pretty far out there. So that my thought was, I need to have a real job. I need to, it wasn't about money. It was about stability, though. I said I need to go ahead and start paying the bills, things like that. So I did think about it, but I didn't think it was a real possibility.
So you just mentioned it wasn't about money, but 2 seconds earlier it was about the money. So I think it's a huge barrier for some pre-med students, and I've talked about this before with Tony Sozo, the financial advisor that I've had on the podcast a couple times. But can you think back when you're in college and you obviously looked into medical school and obviously saw how expensive it was. Was it the fact that you mentioned you didn't really come from a lot of money, or didn't come from any money? Was it the fact that the price tag for medical school was a lot, or did you feel like you had the opportunity to and really needed to, or felt like you needed to, go out and start earning money, and medical school was just a barrier to that?
I definitely felt like the price of medical school just wasn't even attainable. I didn't think that I didn't think it was a possibility. I thought if I would go to try to get a loan for medical school, I'd be laughed out of the office. To grow up on rice and beans, and then think about taking out $20,000 or $40,000 or $50,000, or Indy Medical School with $230,000 in debt. It was less then, but was just an impossibility. You might as well have been talking about $2 million as $150,000.
Okay. Yeah, and that's one of the biggest, I think, problems that we have with the cost of school and the lack of knowledge and information about scholarships and loans. And loans are attainable for people, but I think we're missing out, unfortunately, on a huge subset of our population that grow up in a very similar situation to yourself, that view the cost of medical school as this just Mount Everest of impossibility and put it off on the back burner. Luckily, at some point, you came back around and said, you know what, it's time.
Right.
Now, you mentioned that you kind of sat around and said, where do I want to be in a couple of years? But why at that point was medical school attainable for you?
Well, at that point, it wasn't that medical school was necessarily attainable, but definitely taking that first step and signing up for classes was attainable. And I did take a moment to step back and look at the big picture and say, you know, if I go to medical school now, or if I start taking classes now, I can take these classes and it'll put me into, you know, the cycle and kind of plan forward and realize that, you know, I could be in medical school by the time I'm 39, and, you know, it's not too old. So there was a moment of going, well, it's kind of now or never to take that first step. I also was able to step back and think about using the resources that I have now, you know, as a benefit to medical school rather than a big barrier. I know somebody out there who's sitting out there with a spouse and children and a career that they're sitting on, and they're going, oh, that's a barrier to medical school. Where I really think it's a resource to medical school, because you can look at going, you know, you've probably accumulated some wealth, you've probably accumulated some professional habits, you've probably accumulated some time management skills, some of these things that you might not have had when you were 22 years old. So I thought about some of those strengths and going, you know what, I might be better at medical school now than when I was maybe 21 years old or 22 years old. Obviously, you've got some challenges there with some different responsibilities. But, you know, I guess I could put it out, mapped it out, and said, you know, that's a plan that I could probably do. So, again, I don't know if that answers your question about seeing how I could go to medical school, but that's really how it happened.
No, that's great. So you started taking classes, and you kind of said, you know what, I can do this. Where did you go to next? Obviously, as a military man, you're committed yourself to the Navy. How did you figure out what were the next steps that you needed to take and to make sure that you're doing things right? Because let's be honest, applying to medical school is a huge, overwhelming process. And if you don't do everything right, I'm not saying you have to be perfect, but if you don't do everything right, things can get messy. How did you figure all that out?
No, I completely agree. I did a few different things. One of the things I did, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but early on in the process, I went to the schools that were, especially locally, that I said, you know what, I think I'm going to apply here. So I went and put on a nice uniform and went and knocked on a door and said, hey, I'm not a medical applicant now, but I will be in a couple of years. Here is my resume. Here are the classes I've taken. You know, what do I need to do to be a competitive applicant for you in 2 years? And at that point, the schools were all very willing to sit down and look at my record and look at my package and say, hey, you know, you really should think about doing some shadowing, or, you know, hey, when you hit that organic class, you really make sure you perform in that organic class, and give me feedback that later made me a more competitive applicant. And they gave me feedback that gave me a little bit more confidence that I was going to track in the right directions. They were the same schools who said, hey, make sure that you are submitting your application in the beginning of June, or, you know, as soon as the cycle opens. They were the same schools who were saying, hey, that MCAT, you've got to perform on the MCAT, because that'll shut some doors for opportunities if you mess up the MCAT. And those were some primary sources that I went to for information. Then there were really two other sources that I went to for information. one of them was finding friends. Like I said, you've got some strengths from being a non-traditional. One of those strengths is having friends, personal friends who are physicians who you could go to and say, what did you do when you went through medical school, or what made you competitive, or what are your thoughts about the profession? And so I went to those people and, sat and talked to them and just reconnected with those close friends in my life. Another area that I went to was kind of the area that I think most people jump to right away. And I did too. Like I said, I'm going a little bit out of order, but that's jumping on the different medical school forums and what you're doing is fantastic, because I believe you bring more of a collaborative environment than maybe some of the other sites out there that are just weird.
Well, we'll leave them unnamed.
We'll leave them unnamed. But I mean, you run into these people and you say, "Hey, I'm 37 years old. I'm thinking about to go to med school." And people are going, "No, be a PA or be a nurse or which are fine. I mean, those are things you need to have answers for. But like a more constructive take on that was like, "Hey, have you thought about being a PA? Have you thought about being a nurse?" And that is a reasonable response. But just these snarky comments about, "Oh, you're too old."
You're too old. You don't have a 40 on the MCAT? What?
Right, you don't have a 40. You don't have a 3.9 GPA. You might as well give up. So I always got a kick out of that. One of the other things that I found helpful was going to and I'm going to mess up the name here, but it was like older pre-meds conference. And I think you mentioned it on the show maybe last week or the week before, but there's an actual conference, and it's held in Washington, D.C. in the June timeframe, and that's where I met you. But again, you surround yourself by people who are older pre-meds or non-traditional pre-meds, and it kind of gave you hope that, wow, there are other people out here that are doing this.
Yeah, oldpremeds.org. For those who don't know, if you're listening to this and you live around the Washington D.C. area, it's the National Society for Non-Traditional Pre-Medical and Medical Students. They hold a national conference every year. This is, I think, the 14th annual. And the last couple of years, it's been in D.C. I don't think it always is, but it has been. So if you're in the D.C. area, I highly recommend checking it out. It's oldpremeds.org/conference. Unfortunately, I won't be there this year. I was hoping to go and do some live podcasting, which would have been fun. But with the newborn and some other health stuff that I had mentioned last week, we're staying home. So... but if you're in the area, go there, say hi to Rich for me, and it's a great collaborative environment of being around students who are trying to learn from everybody and learn and help, and it's awesome.
Yep, I agree. I totally agree.
So you reached out to the schools, which Carrie, who I also met at the Old Pre-Meds Conference, she had mentioned a couple episodes ago in episode 74. When you reached out to these schools, were you just showing up on their doorstep, or did you reach out with emails or phone calls first? How did you do that?
The first thing I did was I went on the site and familiarized myself a little bit about their basic things. That way, when I showed up, I had some basic information about the schools. And with one of the schools, I emailed someone in the admissions office and said, this is who I am, and here's a quick summary. I would just like to talk informally about some, my plan here. Maybe someone would be available to talk. In their school, I just showed up and said, hey, I'm here unannounced, and I just wanted to say hi and just kind of meet some faces and tell you where I am. And again, they were maybe it's just the luck of the draw. Maybe it's because they just were not busy that day, or I know as you're not a medical applicant, they're not bound by some of the same issues you are once you do become an official applicant to their school. But I thought that was very helpful in gaining some confidence in knowing that I wasn't going to miss a specific class for their school. And that's why it's important to familiarize yourself with their entrance criteria before you show up. That way you can say, I understand I'll probably need to get a fill in the blank on your MCAT score. I understand that I do need these 4 or 5 classes. And you can show them that plan. And then, I had my portfolio with me with some of my background, my GPA, my previous schools, things like that, and really emphasize it. Hey, this is a you're doing me a favor by sitting down with me. I'm not, this is I don't know what the word I'm looking for, but this is a non-binding conversation here. And again, they were very very willing to sit down and talk.
Did anybody give you the cold shoulder?
No, not at all. I did not get any cold shoulder at all.
Awesome. Good. That's good to hear. And did you keep in contact and follow up with any of these people?
I did. And I said, remember me? Do you remember when I came in here? And you told me to get one of the schools said, well, you get a 30 on the MCAT and an A in organic chemistry, and we'll see you here for an interview. So I showed back up, almost a year and a half later and said, hey, do you remember when you said that? And he said, I sure do. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But, I did keep in contact, say, hey, I just finished that class. Just to let you know, I'm still fired up. I'm so excited about the opportunities there. Just quick, short emails with some people that I kind of connected with in the front office. And, I thought that was beneficial, just gaining that confidence that the process seemed a little bit less mysterious.
Yeah, that's awesome. And we'll talk a little bit, maybe a little bit later on about the results of all of that. But let's talk about your application process.
Okay.
When did you apply?
Okay, I applied in as soon as the application cycle opened, I started putting in all my information. So I think that's in, you might have to help me out here. I think it's usually in or end of May or beginning of June that it actually opened to actually load your information into the AMCAS system.
Yep, so AMCAS will open up so you can play with it in May and then submit in June.
Okay, so I played with it in May, and then I submitted it at, if my memory is right, I submitted it about 3 minutes after it opened in June.
Wow.
So just after it opened in June. And at that point, I had already, a lot of people, they focus on the personal statement so much, and everybody knows, reread your personal statement. Have people you don't know read your personal statement. Have people who you don't like read your personal statement. They focus on that, and that's great. But there's a lot of other writing on that application. There's a lot of places where they say, well, describe to me what you did in that job. Describe to me what you did in that volunteer experience. Describe that shadowing experience. And that gives you a little paragraph there to write, and I would really encourage your non-traditionals to understand that that's an area where they can shine, and that's an area where you can really back up what you have on your personal statement and give a more of a full picture of who you are. And it also, I didn't quite understand it that some things you talk about in your personal statement, you can kind of mention this other thing, mention that volunteer experience. But in that other section of the application is where you can actually start to describe what that particular volunteer experience meant to you, or describe exactly the details there. So not everything you did needs to be described in your personal statement. You have some other areas to explain more.
That's one of the hardest things I think most people struggle with is how do I fit, especially non-traditional students,
right.
How do I fit 38 years of my life into 5,300 characters?
Right.
And that's a good trick is you kind of briefly mention something, and so when these admissions committee members are glancing over your personal statement, and they're not reading it in depth that first time, they're glancing over it, seeing if it's interesting, and then they're glancing over your experiences, and they go, oh, I remember kind of briefly reading something about that one experience, but here it is a little bit more fleshed out. That's a good little trick to kind of extend your personal statement.
That's right.
Cool. So, did you find, and I know the answer to this because I found it difficult, but did you find anything difficult about the AMCAS application?
I did. And I one of the things that I found difficult was, and I guess I'll get into this, I think it'll help somebody else out there, was getting my schools to get all of my transcripts to AMCAS. And I just tell people out there that you can have hiccups there that can cost you weeks and weeks and months of delays if your schools don't get that transcript to AMCAS properly. I had one of my schools, they sent it. It was the first transcript, I think, was unsigned. So AMCAS takes, a week to open it and then a week to send me a letter to say, oh, that one was unsigned. So I have the school send another one. Well, that one was, the print date was too far off of the signature date. So it takes AMCAS another 4 weeks, 5 weeks to notify me of that. A couple cycles like that. And then all of a sudden, even though I've applied, 3 minutes after or 30 seconds after the cycle opens, my AMCAS was not getting verified until I think it was mid-October or late October. So I did find that part of it frustrating. Just wasn't very clear how important some of those things are early in the cycle. So I would really encourage people out there who are applying to make sure these schools are getting their transcripts into AMCAS as soon as you can.
Yeah, because that's really the biggest hang-up initially. Not necessarily hang-up, but the biggest delay is AMCAS. After you submit your application, and COMIS does this as well, they go in and look at all of the grades that you have manually inputted, and they're checking line by line against your transcripts to make sure everything is there and everything looks good. I could easily go in and say I got A's and everything, but they're gonna check. They're gonna check my official transcripts. So that's important. And what you have to do is you have to bring the AMCAS sheet to your school's office and say, "Here is my AMCAS sheet. Take this and submit my transcripts with it." Mm-hmm. So AMCAS knows the transcripts and the ID and everything that goes along with it. And that's a tedious process that you are relying on other people for your success. And it's the same thing with letters of recommendation. Right now, as we're recording this, it's mid-May. And people are probably right this minute going and asking professors and mentors and people, doctors they've shadowed, for letters of recommendation. If you're asking for letters of recommendation past April, you're too late, because the people that are writing these letters are gonna most likely be delayed. Everybody likes to take their time, and you're gonna have to poke and prod them a couple times. And letters of recommendation are one of those other things besides transcripts that you mentioned that hold up an application and can significantly delay it, and that's a huge issue.
I agree.
All right, so you had a couple hiccups with your application, but obviously things worked out. How many schools did you apply to, and how did you choose those schools?
I cast a pretty wide net. Being a military guy, you're not afraid to really move around. So the idea of going to school just about anywhere didn't really scare me too much. So what I did was I applied to all the schools which were in a few-hour drive of where I lived, thinking that those are places you don't have to fly to. I'll get the interview experience showing up to those places, things like that. And then I applied to schools in areas where I had already lived that I knew I could return to and I could enjoy. So I think my initial list was something like maybe 15 schools roughly. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was about 15 schools that I initially kind of threw it out to say, okay, I'll apply to these 15.
Okay. And at, I think it's $160 for that first one, and then $36 for each one. The price adds up.
Right. It'll end up being around $500 pretty quickly.
Yeah. Talk about MD versus DO for a second. Did you apply to any DO schools at all?
I did not apply for DO schools, and really the only reason I didn't apply to the DO schools was because I thought, this is I'm pretty competitive at the MD schools, and I just didn't do it. It wasn't a slight to DO schools. Had there been one system where I could have gone, oh man, I can check these DO schools also, I 100% would have checked DO schools, because there were a few DO schools that I was definitely interested in going and interviewing at and visiting that area and learning more about the school. It was more about the fact that, well, I'm going to apply to these MD schools, and I don't want to really go through an entirely different application process and try to learn a different application process and pay another fee for another application process. So that was the main reason why I didn't go through a DO, the DO route.
Awesome. So let's jump ahead.
Okay.
Are you starting school, medical school soon?
I am. I should start here in June. So, and I'm still haven't nailed down exactly where I'm going. So I've still got a couple options out there that I'm weighing. I have told a few of the schools that I think I'm going to try something different, but I haven't nailed down my final decision yet.
That decision's coming soon, is it not?
It is. I think it's 2 days.
That's very soon.
That's right.
How many schools did you get interviews at?
I got interviews. Again, I'm going to mess up this. I think I interviewed at 7 or 8 schools, or what I ended up interviewing at.
That's
pretty
right. Impressive. Yeah.
Right. And of the 15 schools I initially applied to, a few of those schools, after I did a little bit more digging, I went, I don't have that class. I think there was some biochemistry I didn't have, and a molecular biology that I didn't have. That, I was like, well, I didn't have that school, or I didn't have that class, and why did I waste the $30 on applying to that school? And so of those 15 schools, really not all of them did I have all the requirements for those schools. And there were a couple schools that were admittedly like, that one's totally out of reach. But I will tell people this: there was one school that I applied to that I said, oh yeah, I should definitely get an interview here. Their mission statement is right along right up my alley. Like this is me. And they never called me back for an interview. Never, I got a secondary, but never anything more. And on the flip side of that, there was a school that I applied to in January that I was just driving by and said, I didn't even know this school existed. And when I went on their site and learned about their stats, I said, there's no way I'll get into here. And I applied there, and I got the interview, and I was actually accepted there. So
you applied in January?
I applied in January.
Like 7 months after the application opened?
Yeah, yep. And just by the luck of the draw. So I'll tell people that there are schools that they think they don't have a chance to get into, and they might get into, and there are schools they think there are shoo-ins. And I heard people say there's no such thing as a safety school. I think I'd agree with that.
There isn't, and that's one thing that I try to harp on people is that there are stats. You can go into the MSAR or the CIB.
That's right.
and look at stats, but that is a statistical number derived from a class of 100 people or 200 people that gives no bearing on your chances of getting into that school. That plus the fact that every year the admissions committee sits down and says, what type of class do we want this year?
Right.
Do we want a bunch of jocks? Do we want a bunch of science nerds? Do we want a bunch of humanity majors? Do we want and every year it's a little bit different. It's this ever growing, ever in process thing that happens, and so you can't only apply to schools that meet numbers. And that's your story of applying in January, probably way later than anybody would ever recommend applying. Mm-hmm. And obviously, you added that school. That wasn't your main application, which
that's right.
Would have been a huge no-no. But you got lucky with that one. But that's awesome.
Right. For people who are interested in saying, I just want to go to this medical school, that's a pretty tall order. You just have to look at the statistics and say, of the this many thousand people apply, this many people get in, and understand that there are a lot of smart people with great application packages that just don't get into medical school. There's a lot of smart people who probably don't even get their application even screened or looked at, just because of, like you said, the numbers, and there are different factors there. So I would encourage people just in general to really think about where else you would move. Somebody told me, they said, if medical school X offered you a free ride, would you go there? And if the answer is yes, then go ahead and apply to that school. Because if you never know what can happen. And the thing is you can get hooked onto these other schools in terms of getting excited about them when you didn't even know the programs really existed previously. So again, I would really encourage people, and you've said it before, apply early and apply broadly.
No. Ben, what other final advice would you have for the pre-med out there, non-traditional or traditional student out there struggling with their decision to apply to medical school or make that first step?
For me, it was just understanding that dreams don't come true. It's a plan that comes true, and so you've got to put a plan out there, and you've got to understand that take that. I think Carrie said this last week. You take that first step, and you know what? If you take that biology class and you just don't like it, well, then maybe med school's not what you want to do, or maybe you want to do something else. But you're never going to know unless you take that first class, you take that first step. So I would really encourage people to, right now, if you go out, you can probably make it into a summer session. If you sit here and hem and haw and do I want to be a doctor? Well, you're going to miss a summer session, and then you're going to miss another summer session, and you're never going to take that first step. And so I would just really encourage people that there's time later to decide, do you want to be a doctor? That's a pretty complicated question. But right now you can say, I think I want to. I think I want to apply. I think I want to start going in that direction. I mean, it gets a little cliche, but it's true. It's like we all call this a journey, but at some point you have to realize it's not that you just woke up one day and you're like, I want to be a doctor, and it's like, Shazam, you're a doctor. It's steps. It's one step after the next step. So again, that's my big piece of advice to people is take the first class, see if it works out for you, see if you can balance your life, see if it's something that you dread or something that you for me, I could say I really like this course that I was taking. I really like this chemistry. I don't like the time away from my family, but I like the chemistry. And that's an important distinction between something just going, I dread this. This is terrible for me. Well, if it's terrible for you, then maybe a career or maybe the time in med school is going to be frustrating for other reasons. So take the first step, and I would encourage people to really start looking at that dream and making it a plan.
Well, I hope you learned a lot from that conversation with Ben. There was a lot of information that he talked about, things that he did specifically that worked for him that I think, if you're in very similar situations, would work for you. Now, this is multiple times now that you've heard successful applicants to medical school talk about how they went to admissions committee members several years before they planned on applying to medical school and asked for advice. And I can't stress enough how important it is to go straight to the source. And I try to do that by getting admissions committee members to come on the show and getting deans to come on the show and getting other people that make decisions to come on the show. But for you, in your specific situation, for you to go to an admissions committee member and say, I want to go to this school in 2 years, here's where I'm at, here's my plans, what do you think? Get them to buy off on it. And that's, I think, Carrie's exact words, getting the buy-in. And Ben talks about it again here today. So I hope if you take only one thing away from this podcast is go straight to the source, go to the schools that you want to go to, and get some advice from them. Now remember, as an applicant to medical school, if you are in the process of applying, they are very limited in the information that they can give you. So you need to do this beforehand. You need to be a little proactive a year or two before you're planning on applying and get this information and advice from them. So, you have any thoughts on today's show? Go to the show notes where we'll have links to some of the information that we talked about, hopefully all of the information that we talked about. You can get the show notes, as always, medicalschoolhq.net/77, as in session 77. If you feel like leaving a comment, I hope you do. We'll continue the conversation. You can leave a comment there at the show notes if you just scroll down to the bottom and say hello, leave your comments, suggestions, say hello to Ben. You can also hit me up on Twitter. I am at Medical School HQ. We'd love to hear from you there. Again, continuing the conversation there in 140 characters or less. One of the biggest things that you can do to help the Medical School HQ podcast, if you so choose to do, is leave us a review and rating. You can do that by going to medicalschoolhq.net/iTunes. and leave a review and a rating. The way iTunes works, the way Apple works, is the more ratings, the more reviews that we have, the better it thinks our show is, which hopefully it is, and the higher they rank us, which means more people can see us easily. So I appreciate all of you that take a couple minutes to do that. We have 4 that we need to mention here. Lessa RF says A++++. Gonzo0606 says, amazing. We alleviate so much of the unnecessary stress involved with taking the pre-med path, which is awesome. The Force, Perfection Achieved says The Force. I don't know what The Force means, but maybe it's a little Star Wars reference. And Ryan Michler says, great information, great show. So thank you to those 4 people for those 5-star reviews. Like I said, if you have not left a rating or review yet, medicalschoolhq.net/iTunes. As always, I hope the information that you got today will help better guide you on your path to becoming a physician. And as always, I hope you join us next time here at the Medical School Headquarters.